It was a cold morning in Gyeongju, South Korea. The date was October 31st, 2025. The world's leaders had gathered for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. Cameras were flashing, diplomats were scrambling, but the most important event of the summit didn't happen on the main stage. It happened in a quiet, secured room down the hall, a room where two men sat across from each other, smiling for the first time in nearly a decade. On one side sat Xi Jinping, the president of China. On the other side sat Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada. For most observers, this was just a photo op, a polite diplomatic gesture. But for those of us who watch the shadows of geopolitics, it was something else entirely. It was the sound of a tectonic plate shifting. It was the moment Canada stopped being America's polite little brother and started becoming its most dangerous problem. To understand why this handshake matters, you have to understand the betrayal that led to it. You have to understand why Canada, a founding member of NATO and America's closest ally, would turn to its greatest rival. The answer lies thousands of miles away, in a small town called Ingersoll, Ontario, and in the boardrooms of General Motors in Detroit. This is the story of a betrayal. It is the story of a desperate gamble, and it is the story of how Canada is building a Trojan horse that could bring the American empire to its knees. The betrayal in the heartland. Let's rewind to October 21st, 2025. 10 days before that handshake in Korea, General Motors dropped a bomb on the Canadian economy. They announced the immediate closure of the BrightDrop electric van plant in Ingersoll. There was no warning, there was no negotiation, just a cold corporate memo that destroyed 1,200 livelihoods overnight. For years, Canada had played by the rules. They had subsidized GM. They had integrated their supply chains with the US. They had banned Chinese EVs to please Washington. They had arrested Meng Wanzhou when the DOJ asked them to. They had done everything a loyal ally is supposed to do. And what did they get in return? They got abandoned. GM walked away the moment it became convenient. And they didn't just walk away. They did it with an arrogance that shocked Ottawa. But the pain didn't stop there. From the south, Donald Trump's trade war was escalating. Tariffs on Canadian steel, tariffs on Canadian aluminum, threats to tear up the USMCA trade agreement. Canada found itself trapped in a pincer movement, squeezed by American corporations on one side, and squeezed by American protectionism on the other. The message from Washington was clear: America first and Canada last. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a man who spent his career in the highest levels of global finance, looked at the board. He saw a losing game. If Canada continued to rely solely on the United States, it would be bled dry. It would become a vassal state, begging for scraps from Detroit and Washington. Carney realized that kindness was no longer a currency. Loyalty was a liability. If Canada wanted to survive, it needed leverage. It needed a weapon that would make Washington panic. And there is only one weapon in the world that truly scares the American deep state: China. The secret calculus of revenge. This brings us back to that room in South Korea. When Mark Carney sat down with Xi Jinping, it wasn't a meeting about friendship. It was a meeting about leverage. China has been trying to crack the North American market for years. They have the best electric vehicle technology in the world. Companies like BYD and CATL are years ahead of Ford and GM, but they have been locked out. The US has built a tariff wall so high that Chinese cars cannot climb it. And until recently, Canada was part of that wall. Canada had imposed a 100% surtax on Chinese EVs, marching in lockstep with US policy. But on that day in October, the wall developed a crack. Sources indicate that the conversation between Carney and Xi wasn't just about cooperation. It was a transaction, a dark, geopolitical transaction. Here is the deal that is likely being whispered in the corridors of power. China wants access. They need a backdoor into the North American market to bypass US tariffs. Canada wants survival. They need a manufacturing partner to replace the American companies that are fleeing. If GM won't build cars in Ingersoll, who will? Why not BYD? Why not NIO? Why not XPeng? The logic is terrifyingly simple. If Canada drops its tariffs on Chinese EVs, Beijing will drop its ban on Canadian canola and beef. That's the surface deal. But the deeper play is much more dangerous. If Chinese companies set up factories in Ontario, they become Canadian companies under trade law. They employ Canadian workers. They pay Canadian taxes. And eventually, under the rules of the USMCA, their products could claim North American origin. This is the Trojan horse. Mark Carney is effectively threatening to turn Canada into the assembly line for the Chinese Communist Party. He is signaling to Washington, "If you don't want our goods, we will flood your market with your enemy's goods." It is a suicide vest strategy. Carney is pulling the pin and saying, "Treat us with respect, or we blow up the entire North American auto industry." The Washington nightmare. Imagine the panic in the Pentagon and the White House right now. For 80 years, the United States has taken Canadian loyalty for granted. The border was secure. The airspace was shared under NORAD. The economies were intertwined. But now, the northern flank is exposed. If Chinese tech giants establish a foothold in Canada's industrial heartland, it's not just an economic issue, it's a national security catastrophe. Modern electric vehicles are not just cars. They are rolling surveillance platforms. They have cameras, microphones, LiDAR, and GPS. They collect terabytes of data every day. Imagine thousands of Chinese-made vehicles, built in Canada, driving freely across the Ambassador Bridge into Detroit. Imagine the data they could gather on American infrastructure. Imagine the mapping of military bases. This is why the US banned Chinese software in vehicles. But if Canada integrates Chinese tech into its grid, the firewall collapses. Washington knows this. Donald Trump knows this. And Mark Carney knows they know. That is why he took the meeting. He isn't necessarily planning to sell out to China completely. He is using the threat of selling out to force a better deal from the US. It is geopolitical blackmail. And it is working. Suddenly, the tone in Washington is changing. The arrogance is being replaced by anxiety. American negotiators, who were ignoring Canadian calls, are now booking flights to Ottawa. They realize they have pushed their neighbor too far. But there is a risk, a massive, existential risk. When you invite a superpower like China into your house to scare away a bully, you might find that the new guest never leaves. China doesn't do favors. China does colonization. Look at Africa. Look at Sri Lanka. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative. Investment comes with strings attached, political strings. If Canada allows Chinese factories to replace GM and Ford, they will become dependent on Beijing's supply chains. They will be vulnerable to Beijing's political pressure. Mark Carney is a smart man. He is a central banker. He understands risk management. But is he underestimating the appetite of the dragon? Is he trading an abusive relationship with America for a subservient relationship with China? The domestic shift. Why Canadians are cheering. You might think the Canadian public would be outraged by this pivot. After all, Canadians have been skeptical of China for years. The memories of the two Michaels, the Canadian citizens detained by China, are still fresh. But something strange is happening in the polls. The anger at America is starting to outweigh the distrust of China. When you lose your job because a decision was made in a boardroom in Detroit, you stop caring about geopolitics. You care about putting food on the table. When you see your grocery bills skyrocket because of American tariffs, you stop viewing the US as a protector. You view them as a predator. A recent poll showed that for the first time in history, a significant number of Canadians view the United States as a bigger threat to their economic stability than China. This is the soil in which Carney's strategy is growing. He is tapping into a deep vein of Canadian nationalism, not the polite, apologetic nationalism of the past, but a resentful, angry nationalism. A feeling that Canada needs to stand on its own 2 feet, even if it means dancing with the devil. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, a conservative who usually aligns with American business, has changed his tune. He is calling for a stable relationship with China. Why? Because he needs jobs for his province. If GM leaves, he needs someone to fill that void. And if that someone speaks Mandarin, so be it. This domestic alignment gives Carney the political cover he needs to execute this dangerous maneuver. He can frame it as diversification. He can frame it as protecting Canadian workers. He can frame it as sovereignty. But we know what it really is. It is revenge. The looming war of 2026. All of this is setting the stage for the main event. The mandatory review of the USMCA trade agreement. This was supposed to be a routine checkup, but now it looks like it will be a cage match. Donald Trump has already threatened to blow up the deal if he doesn't get what he wants. He wants to close the Mexican loophole. He wants to protect American manufacturing at all costs. But now he has to deal with the Canadian pivot. Canada is walking into that negotiation with a loaded gun. If the US tries to impose unfair terms, Canada can simply point to the Chinese factories rising in Ontario. They can say, "Fine, kick us out of the North American market. We have a new market now, a market of 1.4 billion people." It is a bluff, of course. Canada cannot survive without the US market. But in a high-stakes negotiation, sometimes a convincing bluff is all you need. The danger is that Trump might call it. He might look at Canada's flirtation with China and decide that Canada is no longer an ally, but a security threat. He could close the border completely. He could sanction Canadian banks. He could declare Canada a hostile trade entity. If that happens, the Canadian economy wouldn't just suffer, it would collapse. We are walking a tightrope over a volcano. One slip, and the North American alliance, the most stable and prosperous partnership in history, disintegrates. The verdict. So, what are we witnessing? Is this the masterstroke of a brilliant strategist, or the desperate flailing of a dying economy? History is full of nations that tried to play two superpowers against each other. Most of them ended up being torn apart. Ukraine tried to balance East and West. Look at where they are now. Canada is playing a dangerous game in a dangerous neighborhood. The meeting in South Korea was quiet. The smiles were polite, but the implications are deafening. Canada has signaled that it is willing to break the unwritten rules of the Western alliance. It is willing to weaponize its geography and its economy to hurt the United States. And in doing so, it might have just started a Cold War within North America. The irony is palpable. GM closed a plant to save money. In doing so, they may have cost the United States its most loyal ally. They may have opened the door for their own destruction at the hands of Chinese competitors. The butterfly effect of that closure is spreading, and the storm is coming. As we watch the construction cranes rise over potential new EV sites in Ontario, we have to ask ourselves, who is really funding them? And what is the price of admission? Mark Carney thinks he can control the dragon. He thinks he can use China as a pawn. But in the game of empires, pawns usually get sacrificed first. Are we watching Canada's rise to independence, or are we watching the first chapter of its subjugation by a new master? The answer lies in the months ahead. And Washington is watching. Beijing is watching. And for the workers in Ingersoll who just wanted to build vans, the world has suddenly become a very large, very scary place. This is not just a trade dispute. This is a realignment of the global order. And it is happening right on America's doorstep. If you think this is just paranoia, look at the numbers. Look at the meetings. Look at the silence from the White House. They are scared. And they should be. Because a betrayed friend is always more dangerous than a known enemy. Canada has woken up, and it is looking for payback. The only question left is, will the US fold, or will they burn the whole house down? We will find out in 2026, but the fuse was lit in Gyeongju, and the explosion is going to be heard around the world.